Dr. Fergus, as I say, a very good evening to you, sir.
Yes, Ruskin, good evening. Good evening to our colleague at Talk City, particularly the Ruskin Mark and the listeners on that frequency, 91.1 FM. Good evening, my brother. Also, greetings and warm welcome to our viewers on Facebook Live and on YouTube as well. Indaba, after a short break, is back with a packed program this evening. The Africa Report will bring an update on the Ethiopian mega dam, the Grand Renaissance Dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and that will be followed by a discussion on the long-standing injustice against Cuba by way of the United States embargo. And in the second half hour, we host Ambassador David Comissiong to engage us in perhaps the most pressing issue facing the Caribbean for a very long time, and that's the United States military buildup of the coast of Venezuela and the continuing slaughter of crews and small vessels heading out of Colombia and Venezuela. And of course, Trinidad fishermen are also facing the same risk of sudden death by missile strikes. So we are going to be talking about that in the second half hour. The Emancipation Support Committee has issued a press release, so we are going to read that to you as an introduction to that segment after the lottery break on 91.1 FM. We want our listeners to participate by texting or leaving a voice message on the WhatsApp number that you see at the bottom of your screen. And of course, you can leave us messages on Facebook and YouTube, and we will bring your comments and views to the table for discussion. So please join us. This is Indaba, a program of the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. And we are on live this evening. Good evening. We will start with our Africa Report. We are expecting our brother Shabaka to join us shortly. This topic is very close to his heart, both topics, so I'm sure he would be joining us very shortly, perhaps just after or during the Africa Report. And we have in the background, I hope she was coming forward, our sister Renee Francois. She's handling the technical stuff as usual. I was hoping to have her up front. So Renee, without further ado, we have so much to address this evening. Let's take in the Africa Report. Those were the sounds of fireworks at the inauguration of Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam, or GERD, G-E-R-D as it is commonly known. This week's Africa Report pivots on the second African Union CARICOM Summit held in Ethiopia on the 6th and 7th of September 2025. The Africa Report will seek to synchronize that event with Ethiopia's other summit achievement in commissioning the GERD. I call it a summit achievement because Ethiopia accomplished this feat against all odds, reminiscent of its victory over the Italians at Adwa in 1896, when it stood alone against all the forces of Western imperialism. The Africa Report has brought updates on GERD in several Indaba programs, so it is only fitting to present the final chapter of this engineering marvel, the largest hydroengineering project on the continent in recent history. In July 2025, Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed announced dramatically, quote, "The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is now complete," end quote. But the timing of the inauguration was significant, planned to take place against the backdrop of the AU CARICOM summit. The dam has been appropriately described as, quote-unquote, a sovereignty project. The reservoir, of over 1 mile long and 145 meters high, was built without external loans. Instead, it was funded by Ethiopians at home and in the diaspora, by civil servants donating portions of their salaries, buying bonds, and multiple other ways, raising funds, and keeping the spirit alive by patriotic advocacy. The dam has a capacity of over 6,000 megawatts, which could dramatically improve the lives of Ethiopians and propel the country into Africa's biggest exporter of power. The commissioning of good rivaled, but was not at cross purposes with, the AU CARICOM summit. This fact was appropriately demonstrated in the invitation to Barbados's Prime Minister, Mir Amal Motley, to bring greetings on behalf of CARICOM. Among Caribbean heads of state, Motley has perhaps made the greatest number of trips to Africa ever. This is how she shared the pride of Caribbean people in this great accomplishment.
Your Excellency, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, my dear brother, and Mrs. Ahmed, distinguished heads of state and heads of government of Africa, distinguished guests of the people of Ethiopia. If this was to achieve simply the provision of water and energy to the people of Ethiopia and surrounding countries, it would be a marvel of history, a marvel of engineering, and a boon for the prosperity of the people of this region. But if we are to be honest, it is not simply the achievement of what has been done here for the provision of water and energy and the catalytic effect that it will have on economic and social development and security, but it is the journey. Above all else, the journey. The journey of a people who have remained proud throughout history, who have attested that the origins are here, and who have defied all attempts to keep them down. When we toured the facility in the last few hours, I turned to my brother and I said, this is the ADWA engineering feat. And I say so for those who do not know, including many from my own Caribbean community, that when the international world determined that this project was not to see the light of day, that it was not to receive the financing of companies that like to make money and therefore were usually only interested in repayments, that when that befell the people of Ethiopia, the people stood tall, and the people determined that this project was not beyond them, and that it was going to see the light of day, even if it meant that every person who could give, however small, however large, could do so, and even if it meant that it would take much longer than it would otherwise have taken to build. The people of Ethiopia stood tall and put their money where their mouth is.
Motley concluded her address with a Pan-African appeal for unity of purpose.
I leave you, the people of Ethiopia today, confident that if we, as I said in Algeria last week, can rise to the occasion of working together, then this continent and its people and its diaspora, that will be responsible for 1/4 of the world's population, that has given us a demographic dividend that no other continent is now giving us, that we know that you can rise, we can rise, and that we shall be the humanizing element that the world needs now more than ever. Let us go forward in love, in unity, one aim, one purpose, one destiny. Congratulations to the people of Ethiopia. Thank you.
The dam is built across the Blue Nile, the shorter but more voluminous tributary of the Nile River system. In ancient times, the citizens of Kemet, or ancient Egypt, lived in fear that Kush, or Ethiopia, could weaponize the Nile waters against them. This fear has lived throughout the planning and construction of GERD since it was commissioned by Prime Minister Leydis Bernal in 2011. Sudan relies heavily on the Blue Nile, but Egypt is much more dependent on it for their survival. It is not surprising that Egypt has invoked flawed colonial treaties such as the 1929 and 1959 Nile Waters Agreement that gave 55.5 billion cubic meters of the Nile waters to Egypt, 18.5 billion meters to Sudan, and 0 to Ethiopia. Egypt views the GERD as an existential threat to its survival, while Ethiopia views the dam as essential for its economic development. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed timed the second AU summit to host the ceremonial inauguration of the dam. Basking in national pride and overcome by emotion to the point of being bathed in tears, Prime Minister Abiy said, quote, "Our national perseverance against all odds has delivered," end quote. This statement profoundly captured the threats posed by the forces persistently allied against the project, including Sudan and Egypt, Somalia, the Arab League, and the United States of America. In 2020, Donald Trump goaded Egypt to bomb the GERD. Abiy stood firm and warned his protractors, quote, "We will not negotiate with anyone over the sovereignty of Ethiopians," end quote. It is ironic that the same year that Trump is back, the GERD is commissioned. This is a profound demonstration that with proper leadership, Africa is unstoppable. While Sudan and Egypt remain opposed to the GERD, Abiy Ahmed was busy forging alliances with countries in the region, mainly upstream of the Nile and beyond, including Rwanda, South Sudan, Uganda, Tanzania, and the DRC, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo. 1 week after the summit, the Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement was announced. Under this agreement, these signatory countries, along with Ethiopia, established the Nile River Basin Commission, a body which is tasked with coordinating cooperation among the states. Abiy Ahmed called the alliance of states the Nile family. In demonstrating regional statesmanship, he extended an olive branch to Sudan and Egypt to join the agreement. The AU CARICOM Summit was convened under the theme Transcontinental Partnership in Pursuit of Reparatory Justice for Africans and the people of African descent through reparations. An Ethiopian vlogger interestingly made the connection between the dam and reparatory justice. Let's conclude this report with his remarkable vision.
This is more than a congratulation message. This is a wake-up call to Africa and their children in the continent and to those who are in the diaspora to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, to tell ourselves that if we can come together, anything is possible.
And so that's your Africa report for this week, the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam. Of course, it is up and running now. And has quite a lot of promise. I welcome my brother, Shabaka Kambon. He is with us. Welcome, my brother. And I don't know if you listened to the report.
I got most.
But if you wish to make a brief comment, then we move on, or we can move on right away, because we have a lot to talk about and we don't have much time to talk about.
Of course, I know we have our own business to discuss, but I can't help but acknowledge the fact that the brother of the King of England, the former colonial authority, the Masters, has found himself in a bit of hot water lately and had to give up, in some form or fashion, his titles as a result of his involvement with a child trafficking, sexual trafficking ring, and with a Jewish gentleman called Jeffrey Epstein and his collaborator Jane Maxwell. And of course, the latest news today coming out of the American media, and lots of people talking about it. Another prominent person has been involved in this, sex trafficking operation. That is, and of course, these aren't confirmed yet, but it's the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. All the reports coming out of the American media now indicate that he was also part of this ring. And so we expect much more from that. But I don't want to distract from our business, Dr. Fergus. We have lots to discuss tonight. We have our guests here.
Yes, indeed. So let us introduce our guest, Mr. Peter Burke. He's the Vice President of the Trinidad and Tobago Friends of Cuba. We are expecting Ms. Leydis Bernal Suarez of the Cuban Embassy. Is she here? Yes, welcome, Ms. Suarez. Senora Suarez. She's a consular in charge of consular affairs at the Cuban Embassy. Welcome to both of you. Cuba, of course, has never enjoyed its independence from Spanish colonialism, American colonialism, and neo-colonialism. Of course, we know after the War of Independence, they were stifled. The independence was stifled by the Roosevelt corollary and an American base. And of course, after the 1959 revolution, shortly after the Cuban embargo, against which they have been struggling ever since, despite resolutions by the United Nations condemning, in fact, almost the entire world would have condemned, except the two that always vote together on any progressive issues. So welcome to both of you, and I would think my brother Shabaka would want to address this issue and introduce the questions.
Yes, so let me say again, Sister Leydis and Brother Peter, and tonight we're going to discuss the embargo, but we're not going to talk about I want to get a specific issue within this question of the embargo. So let me just add to what Dr. Fergus is saying. He already expressed the fact that in October 1960, the embargo was imposed. We know that this decision was taken by the American authorities to remove Castro and to end the Cuban Revolution by alienating internal support through disenfranchisement and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction or hardship. We know this from the documents coming out of the United States of America, that every possible means and inconspicuous avenues were used to weaken the economic life of Cuba, to bring about hunger, desperation, and an overthrow of government. We know this. here's the part here's what I want to ask. In 2019, the Cuban government argued that it was an act of genocide under Article 2B and C of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which states that once you have engaged in any means, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Once all these issues, once all these areas are met, then you are in breach of this particular article under the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So that's where I want to start. Is that still the position of the Cuban government today, that this embargo is in fact a genocidal embargo?
Okay.
Well,
Peter, you or me?
okay, well, that's a very interesting question. Primarily because a study was done by the Cuban government a few years ago, and the impact of the embargo, right, was calculated in dollar terms. And what was discovered is that the embargo would have costed the Cuban economy over $200 billion during its existence. And that $200 million would not only have impacted on the actual economy in the sense of losses in trade and so on, it would have impacted on industrialization, maintenance, medicine, agriculture, almost every aspect of economic life in Cuba. And in fact, once these areas are affected, the loss of life and health of the Cuban people is tremendous, right? So in terms of what is happening on the ground in the Cuban economy, and the social life, the Cuban economy has been impacted severely by the embargo and has translated itself into human suffering and stifled development. So in that regard, it would seem that the articles can be properly evoked given its effect.
Peter, let me, on behalf of the brothers and sisters across the region, congratulate you and people like yourself who have, across the Caribbean, who have taken it upon yourself to act as spokespersons to call out the injustice taking place in Cuba. This is global act. And let me turn to our friend who is from Cuba, Sister Leydis. Sister Leydis, we are getting reports consistently. We're having a problem here with dogs.
Yeah,
Yeah, please, I'll address that. But we're getting reports here consistently of things getting worse on the ground in Cuba. Access to food, medicine, and clean water are challenges at the moment. Can you speak to that?
yeah, the challenges in Cuba, we have right now many challenges. That you mentioned the article about the blockade, because for us it's a blockade, it's not one embargo. This blockade is one act of genocide. Not only because affect the Cuban people. Not only that, the blockade affect the including the U.S. people. The U.S. people and other countries also are suffered the impact of the blockade. And we have many examples in our report during all year that we present this report in United Nations, the General Assembly. But the Cuban people now have many challenges, not only the medicine, the food, our national power system, only the trade, the bilateral trade, and the international trade also, because not only the bilateral trade with US, many countries we can export or import goods of different countries, and also the bank sector, the finance sector also. And we have different challenges in all sectors in our society, because our government try all day, because we have examples in different sectors. Our government try every day to find the way to obtain books, to obtain food, to obtain medicine, because, for example, Cuba can make medicine, but sometimes the raw material, we don't have the raw material. We have to import the raw material to make the medicine. And right now, our health system is suffering that because the basic medicine, we don't have the basic medicine in our health system. And for that reason, the challenges right now for the Cuban people are so strong. Also the blackout.
Yeah, when we talk about the health system in Cuba, let's acknowledge, first of all, the tremendous strides that the Cuban people have made in spite of the embargo, to have one of the most incredible healthcare systems in the entire Caribbean. And that is celebrated even across the world. And this is in spite of the fact that the raw materials, and not only has the Cuban healthcare system inspired and is highly respected across the world for its achievements, and of course, let's acknowledge the fact that if it wasn't for the ingenuity of the Cuban people, you'd be looking at an absolute disaster zone when it comes to health, based on the nature of the embargo that we're talking about here. But ladies, we are in. I understand that the situation is very bad now, because even the raw materials that you all need to import, and I think this is what the point that you're making, even the raw material that you import to make those medical breakthroughs, to develop your own medicines and produce your own medicines in Cuba and so on, which the entire region benefits from in different ways, even that is embargoed as well.
Sorry, what is the question? Is the
So that even I think what you were getting at was that even the raw materials you need to produce the medicines that you're not allowed to import, to satisfy the demand of the people of Cuba, even that raw material is embargoed. You know, yeah, and I think the point that I want to get across to my listeners here in Trinidad and Tobago is that the mainstream narrative on Cuba is that the problems that the Cuban people face have something to do with the lack of capacity of the Cuban government, when in fact the Cubans have been facing a 60-year, 6-decade long illegal embargo.
I believe we might be having some connectivity issues this evening,
Help us.
and maybe quality of audio. We apologize for that if that is across the board.
Yeah. No.
So the big question, of course, would be, what are the prospects of easing the pressures of the embargo, either in the near future or any time in the future at all? We know that things would have been eased under the Obama regime, and to some extent,
What's wrong?
Wow, we have lost Dr. Fergus. We are having all kinds of connectivity issues. But yeah, Doctor, I understand there's a vote coming up at the United Nations, another vote. I know that the vote in 2021, the only two nations that voted to sustain the embargo were the United States of America and its ally in genocide, Israel. When is that vote going to take place? And do you expect the outcome to be the same?
Well, the outcome more than likely will be the same. However, I think the international community has overwhelmingly supported the right of Cuba to exist as a sovereign society and their right to pursue the happiness and all the rights of a sovereign nation. Unfortunately, and we haven't mentioned this before, but the embargo was codified in a piece of legislation called the Helms-Burton Act. And prior to the last Trump administration, just 2 of the 3 articles were in effect. The third article of that bit of legislation seems to want to persecute third-party countries. So it's not only affecting the Cuban economy and the Cuban people, but it seeks to punish third countries and individuals in third countries who would want to do business with Cuba. And that is where we are at the moment. Unfortunately, the structure of the UN as it is does not preclude such an overwhelming majority of the member states having sway. All it needs is one veto from the permanent members of the Security Council, and we are back to square one. So in order to address the very, very good question that you asked, when will this come to an end? I think the key would be the restructuring of the UN and the decision-making processes. The Security Council was a creature at the end of World War II. It tried to address the shortcomings of the League of Nations, but it went to the other extreme. And we have a situation now where the organization is hamstrung by the veto by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council.
Yeah, we take note of the injustice that is built in structurally to the international community right now. I think everybody's aware of it. The question I want to ask you is, are you concerned now, based on the recent utterances of our Prime Minister, that Trinidad and Tobago, which has already said it is not sort of stepped or moved away from the usual principal response of CARICOM to these kinds of issues on the question of Venezuela, that our Prime Minister will not stand with the rest of the international community to condemn the blockade when the vote comes up in Parliament in the United Nations in the next, I think it's in the next couple of weeks. Ladies, you could correct us.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, okay. We are not here in Trinidad and Tobago. We don't have any information, a confirmation about that. But today, our Minister of Foreign Affairs he denounced the campaign that U.S. is doing with different countries. Is organized one campaign pressure different countries that vote against this resolution because every year this resolution obtained the majority, the support of the majority members of the United Nations. But this year, U.S. is organizing one campaign. Today, our minister denounced this action. They pressure different countries to vote against our resolution.
Yeah, ladies, that our country is susceptible to that kind of pressure. This is why I want to leave the last question here because we're going to close this segment to Peter. Peter, is Trinidad, do you think Trinidad will vote with the rest of the international community to condemn the blockade, as is our principal stand traditionally, or is something new going to happen? And if it does, how will we treat with our current government and Prime Minister? Questions to you, Peter.
Well, that's a fair question.
We need to close the segment. We need to close the segment, and we would like to have your closing remarks at this time. What next? What do you expect of the Caribbean people in putting pressure on the United States to end this criminal embargo, or at least to ease the pressure on the Cuban people to let them breathe? As you give us your closing remarks, you can speak to that as well.
Well, the Caribbean people have taken the lead in ending the diplomatic isolation of Cuba in the hemisphere. When before, they used to call them MDCs in those days, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados, and Guyana opened diplomatic relations with Cuba when larger countries to our south and west were intimidated to do so. I expect that the Caribbean will hold firm and support our Caribbean brothers and sisters and maintain that strong traditional bond that we have maintained since the early 70s. As a result, I think it's important that we use our diplomacy and powers of persuasion to ensure that we maintain the Caribbean as a last peaceful zone, one of the last peaceful zones in the world. And it's important that we do that for the well-being of our descendants.
Peter, Dr. Fergus has taken you slightly off track with the question, but you're going to answer this question before you go. Is the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, based on her recent utterances in relation to Venezuela and her support for the U.S. government, her open support for the U.S. government, do you think she's going to vote with the rest of the region to condemn the blockade? And if not, what do we do?
Well, I would want to think that the strong tradition of the Caribbean support for Cuba will be maintained. Some of the utterances have been a little disturbing, and but I believe on the positive side that the Caribbean, the CARICOM, is strong enough to withstand these glitches. I do not think that any action could be taken by anyone except the electorate, depending on how this goes, because any conflagration in this region, and people not really thinking about that, can affect us, can affect our economy, our safety, and therefore we have to tread carefully in this matter.
Thanks, brother. We got to close now. Ladies, thank you for joining us. We just want to reiterate to our public that the that embargo by the United States of America, or blockade, as ladies refer to it, is seriously hurting the Cuban people, and we can imagine that if something like that, we saw a similar blockade in Venezuela in 1918, and we saw 6 to 7 million people leave the country. So we know the stranglehold that powerful countries can have in the economic environment when they're ready to do so. We know the pain. We share our solidarity with you and the Cuban people, ladies. And of course, all power to you, Peter, for your support. And we hope that our Prime Minister will keep the tradition of CARICOM, the principles that we stand by, alive, and we support the overwhelming majority of the national community in condemning the blockade. Thank you very much for being with us here tonight on Indaba.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Dr. Fergus, introduce our next segment, please. Dr. Fergus we seem to have.
Yeah, we want to welcome Ambassador David Comissiong for the next segment. There has been an upsurge in advocacy for keeping the Caribbean as a zone of peace. And with that in mind, the Emancipation Support Committee has indeed issued a press release dated the 21st of October, and I would read that before we engage Ambassador Comissiong. So bear with me a little bit, Ambassador. This is the press release. The Caribbean must remain a zone of peace. The Emancipation Support Committee is clear that the Caribbean must remain a zone of peace, and in this regard, strongly condemns the recent aggression and provocation by the United States of America in our region, manifested by the extrajudicial execution of at least 27 persons. I think that has gone up to 32, including 2 Trinidadians by some 6 drone strikes, blowing up ships out of the waters within our region, and an intense buildup of war machinery off the coast of Venezuela. We thank and stand in solidarity with CARICOM governments which issued a release reaffirming the principle of maintaining the Caribbean as a zone of peace, and with civil society organizations across the region who have issued statements entitled "In Nobody's Backyard," open letter opposing U.S. military incursions and reaffirming the Caribbean as a zone of peace. I believe, David, you had something to do with that. As the ESCTT strengthens its advocacy for decolonization, it is intolerable to watch these efforts by the United States of America to threaten the sovereignty of Caribbean states by reasserting principles of the Monroe Doctrine, which the U.S. believes gives its government the right to arbitrarily intervene in countries in the region to quote-unquote stabilize them, or in fact engage in activity to prevent what might be perceived as a threat to the U.S. hegemony in the region. As we commemorate this month the Grenada Revolution, and in fact the execution of its leader, Maurice Bishop, we are reminded of the relentless struggle of the people of Haiti to become the first democratic republic in the Western Hemisphere, and the strength and success of the Cuban people in shaping their own destiny. Grenada remains for us in the English-speaking Caribbean an outstanding example of struggle towards decolonization. Let us remember the devastating murder of our beloved Maurice Bishop, leader of that revolution, and how the U.S. responds to such perceived threats. I will end with the final paragraph in the interest of time. We, the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, must stand in unity regardless of political or any other affiliation and raise our voices against U.S. aggression. War in our region will negatively affect all of us. Trinidad and Tobago in particular stand a mere 10 miles away from Venezuela, who will definitely be caught in a crossfire. We must all stand in defense of our countries, our present and the future generations. And that's the end of the press release. Brother Comissiong, could you give us a little background into the origin of this principle of zone of peace, because it did originate, I believe, with Maurice Bishop way back in 1979. Could you start with a background of that very important declaration which was sanctioned by the United Nations? Welcome to Indaba.
Thank you, Dr. Fergus. Greetings to Shabaka. Yes, well, the root of the zone of peace, I would say a good place to start is a 1978 United Nations General Assembly resolution. This was a resolution, this was a debate on disarmament, and the resolution that was passed by the General Assembly said that different regions of the world were at liberty to designate their region zones of peace, and that the countries within those zones were at liberty to determine what were the principles or characteristics of those zones of peace, provided that those principles cohered with the principles of the United Nations Charter. So that was a UN resolution passed in 1978. And a year later, in October of 1979, Grenada, under late Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, they were the first country to act upon that new international law principle that had been established by the UN. And Grenada co-sponsored a resolution in the Organization of American States designating the Caribbean as a zone of peace. And the operative part of that resolution that was successfully passed spoke about, first of all, that the Caribbean was in nobody's sphere of influence. It disavowed the whole concept of spheres of influence, that any disputes were to be settled peacefully, and it disavowed the idea of use of force or threats of use of force, and it also promoted the idea of ideological pluralism and respect for self-determination. So that for the Caribbean was the beginning, that 1979 OAS resolution. And from there on, CARICOM, the Standing Committee of Foreign Ministers, Caribbean Civil Society, the Caribbean Conference of Churches, basically the CARICOM entities, both governmental and civil society, in the succeeding years, fleshed out that concept of the Caribbean being a zone of peace. And I think that whole process really culminated in January of 2014, when the CARICOM countries, as a component of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Countries, CELAC, at the CELAC conference in Havana, Cuba in 2014, CELAC passed a substantial resolution designating the Caribbean a zone of peace and identifying what were the principles of that zone of peace. And of course, non-interference in the legitimate internal affairs of countries, respect for self-determination, respect for every country's right to pursue its own political, economic, cultural system. So I can say to you, from the time I became Barbados's ambassador to CARICOM in 2018, that it has been acknowledged on all sides that a fundamental plank of CARICOM's collective foreign policy really is this idea that our Caribbean region is a zone of peace, and we have stood very firmly on that plank of our coordinated, I should say coordinated foreign policy. Just as our solidarity with Cuba and our opposition to the US blockade against Cuba, that is another fundamental plank of CARICOM's foreign policy.
Could you deconstruct, David, could you deconstruct this notion of peace, zone of peace? Because to undermine peace, it does not necessarily mean war as such, but there are so many other strategies, like deploying the CIA, as has been recently boasted by Donald Trump. That to me is an act of war. And not necessarily, missile strikes and boots on the ground and so on. So this kind of war has always been waged against Caribbean states by the United States of America. Could you explain for our audience why Venezuela in particular, and why did it begin with Hugo Chavez, and what has happened to step it up at this point in time? Why the sudden expansion in that military aggression against Venezuela?
Well, first of all, we have to make a determination as to whether the story being spun by the United States of America, whether we buy that story. Their story is that they have deployed these warships and this nuclear submarine and all of these military assets into the Southern Caribbean in pursuit of drug traffickers. Now, do we accept that? I don't accept that. My own reading of the situation is that the United States is in the process of flaunting its power, projecting its power in a very intimidatory way, and it has selected Venezuela as the convenient target or victim of that projection of US military power. And of course, Venezuela is unique in that Venezuela has the world's largest stock of hydrocarbon resources. And, the US president, he has made it absolutely clear on more than one occasion that this is a prize that they would like to get their hands on. So yes, what is happening? I mean, to send warships, to send a nuclear submarine into our region, to engage in attacks on small vessels, blowing them out of the water. Clearly, this infringes the basic principles of our region being a zone of peace. I mean, those principles are very clear. Those principles are about no use of force. Not even those principles are against threats of force, use of force. Those principles say that the Caribbean is in no one's sphere of influence, that ideological pluralism must be respected, that we must respect nations' right to self-determination, that there must be no interference in the internal affairs of countries. So yes, what is happening in our region is a breach of the concept of the Caribbean being a zone of peace. CARICOM signaled that with its statement. It reaffirmed its commitment to maintaining our region as a zone of peace. And but I think we are still juggling with the story that the United States is spinning, that somehow this is about going after drug traffickers as opposed to going after Venezuela. And I think we are going to have to make up our minds on that issue. The CARICOM statement was not very clear. It tried to straddle, I guess, both interpretations. It did make a point about demanding that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of our countries must be respected, but it also spoke about being in favor of anti-drug trafficking operations, however, insisting that they must be done within the ambit of international law and within the ambit of the cooperation that we have had in the past in terms of dealing with the drug issue. But my fear really is for Venezuela, because I think that there's a very clear threat and danger to Venezuela. And I think that the duty of the Caribbean now is really to express solidarity with Venezuela and to do all that we can to forestall any kind of military attack on Venezuela, as we did in 2019. In 2019, there was a similar challenge under the same Trump presidency, when Juan Guaido suddenly declared himself president of Venezuela, and immediately the US State Department recognized him. And the CARICOM leadership, we recognized where this was going, that this was heading really towards some kind of military intervention in Venezuela. And CARICOM mobilized immediately. The heads of government met in emergency session. We immediately put out a statement that our region is a zone of peace. There must be no intervention in our region. And we dispatched a team of 3 prime ministers: the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Rowley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and the Prime Minister of St. Kitts, along with the Secretary General of CARICOM. Immediately, we dispatched that 4-person team to the United Nations to engage with the Secretary General, to engage with the ambassadors of the major nations, and to say to everybody, hands off the Caribbean. This is a zone of peace. Whatever contention there is in Venezuela, it must be settled peacefully. We CARICOM, we will facilitate a dialogue among the parties. So I would say in 2019, CARICOM was much more proactive in asserting itself and defending that concept of the Caribbean being a zone of peace. In this case, fast forward to 2025, we haven't seen that same level of assertiveness. However, I should say that that there is diplomacy, quiet diplomacy going on behind the scenes. I don't think the Caribbean people should have any doubts that the statesmen and stateswomen of the Caribbean community who have shown great solidarity.
At the top of the hour, David, 91.1 listeners normally would leave us, so we want to thank them for joining us. If they are leaving us at 8, it's almost at that time. So thank you very much, and see you again next week. The press release of the EFCC, the media release, speaks to the real agenda of the United States being to achieve regime change in Venezuela, David. Regime change. Well, and it makes reference to the many other instances in the Caribbean. We know of Cuba, as I mentioned earlier in the program, with respect to destabilizing Cuban independence. We know of Haiti, the Dominican Republic. We know of Grenada. So could you speak to that in the context of the press release by the Emancipation Support Committee? And then, of course, Brother Shabaka would get into the picture. The real agenda is regime change, whether by war. In other words, all of the military tactics might simply be a cover to ensure that President Nicolas Maduro is overthrown, and of course the curious award of the Nobel Peace Prize to a Venezuelan opposition leader. Very curious. So could you speak to that, and then Shabaka would come in.
Well, that is what I've been saying. I made the point that the U.S. story is that they are about combating drug trafficking. And I said that I personally don't accept that. And that that I believe that what is happening is that they are targeting Venezuela precisely for regime change, and that there is a danger that this buildup of military assets could end in a military attack on Venezuela. And I made the point that we have to do all that we can to forestall that and to show solidarity with Venezuela for several reasons. Number one, first of all, it is in keeping with maintaining our region as a zone of peace. That is number one. But secondly, Venezuela has been a great friend. Venezuela is a sister Caribbean nation and has been a wonderful friend to all of us in the Caribbean community. We have had long and very substantial relationships with Venezuela. So I am making the point that all of us in the Caribbean community, our governments, as well as our civil society, our duty now is to rally around Venezuela, to show that solidarity to Venezuela, and to do all that we can to ensure that this thing does not escalate to a direct military attack on Venezuela. I was also going on to say that the people of the Caribbean can rest assured that the statesmen and stateswomen of the Caribbean are in fact carrying out quiet diplomacy designed to steer this whole disturbing situation towards a peaceful resolution.
Yes, David.
Yes,
Yeah, let me introduce a letter that I have here that has been sent to the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago by Brother Sekaya Thomas. He is the Ambassador General of the Global African Congress, a long-standing and respected Pan-African organization. On the 19th of October, he wrote, and the subject of the letter is your reckless endorsement of U.S. militarism and the betrayal of Caribbean sovereignty. Dear Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar, as a concerned Caribbean citizen, I write to condemn in the strongest terms your recent statement defending the Trump administration's deadly actions in the Caribbean waters. Acts carried out by the U.S. military that have resulted in the killing so far of 27 presumed innocent Caribbean fishermen and the violation of our regional sovereignty. He goes on to say that, to describe Kamla's words not only as reckless, but that as also disgraceful and shameless. So this letter is written in the strongest possible terms. He says, Madam Prime Minister, I'm frankly ashamed that as the Prime Minister of our beloved Trinidad and Tobago, your marginalization and maybe even your excusing of the extrajudicial killings and dismissing the U.S. violation of international law, that you have not only aligned yourself with Donald Trump and U.S. imperialism and against your sovereign people, but you have also aligned yourself with the same imperial ideology that once enslaved our people and plundered our lands. He says, in this context, it is impossible not to ask you precisely what inspired you to abandon the voices of political leadership, national and regional interests, and conscience that once defined our region. And he mentions Prime Minister Eric Williams, Michael Manley, Errol Barrow, Maurice Bishop, and others, who he said stood up to global powers and asserted the Caribbean's right to self-determination. He said, Madam Prime Minister, sadly your defense of Washington's militarism is a betrayal of the legacy and of every Caribbean citizen who believes in justice, equality, and sovereignty. And he also suggests, and Dr. Fergus, perhaps you and Ambassador Comissiong could correct me, I'm not sure, I haven't heard this remark, but he says that the Prime Minister defended Zionist Israel's so-called right to defend itself in some speech, and that despite their genocide against the Palestinian people. And he says, let me ask plainly, does Venezuela not have the same right to protect its territory and people from foreign aggression? Or do these rights only apply when the aggressor is backed by Western powers? And of course, he goes on in his final paragraph. He says, we call on you to retract your statement and to reaffirm your government's commitment to the sovereignty of every Caribbean nation, the protection of human life, and the upholding of international law. Anything less would mark your leadership as complicit in the new age of colonial aggression. Our ancestors did not fight and die for independence only to have their descendants handed back in silence to the US neo-colonialists. The Caribbean people are watching, history is watching, and you and your government will be justly judged by your people and those of the extended Caribbean in defense of Caribbean freedom and justice. This is Brother Sekaya Thomas from the Global African Congress. Very strong words. Of course, we heard Brother David Abdullah issue a similar condemnation of the Prime Minister's statements, as reckless and shameless in her defense of the strategy of killing so-called alleged drug traffickers in the region using drone strikes, which of course the international community is increasingly condemning across the board as illegal. And of course, Sekaya is in that tradition. Gentlemen, first, the question of Israel. Are you all familiar with a statement by our Prime Minister supporting, the Zionist regime and what's happening there?
I'm not familiar with such a statement.
Okay, neither am I, but we will do some further research to find out. But certainly, there are other statements that the Prime Minister has made in support of the drone strikes, which, by all indications, are illegal in international law, and the build-up in the region, which increasingly seems to point to regime change, which goes against CARICOM, that position that Trinidad has taken, which is outside of CARICOM, and condemnation of the idea of the zone of peace. Very early on, our Prime Minister did say that people using this notion, this phrase, the zone of peace, are really using it because they don't like the United States of America. She did make such statements. What is your position on that, Brother Comissiong? Of course, I know that you are with the region on this matter, but certainly these are strong statements from Brother Thomas.
Well, I would not want to comment on matters pertaining to the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So that's the first point. CARICOM is a grouping of independent countries. The revised Treaty of Chagarama says that we should try to coordinate our foreign policies, and that is what the CARICOM countries try to do, to come to a common or collective foreign policy. But in the event where that is not possible, individual countries are entitled to take their own, to pursue their own sovereign foreign policy. the point that I made that traditionally the insistence that the Caribbean community is a zone of peace, the Caribbean is a zone of peace, has been a fundamental plank of that, let us say, coordinated CARICOM foreign policy. In this instance, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has taken a different position. It accepted itself from the statement issued by CARICOM, what was it, earlier this week, last week, late last week. But I think that the CARICOM position is the correct one, that the concept of a zone of peace is very, very critical to our region. Most of our economies are tourism-based economies. This is a region that a fragile region, very open economies, and it's very, very important that we maintain peace within our region. And that, as I said, that concept of a zone of peace really is a confirmation of the fundamental principles of international law as enshrined in the United Nations Charter. So I think that CARICOM must insist on our region being respected as a zone of peace, and that there be no eruptions of military conflict, threats, or use of force within our Caribbean community. However, I would like to caution that, in my opinion, emphasis now for Caribbean civil society is solidarity with Venezuela and protection of Venezuela from any military attack on it, any more direct and substantial military attack upon it by the United States of America. And so that requires us to make a judgment about the purpose of the American activities in the Southern Caribbean. Are those activities really about combating drug trafficking, or are they about targeting Venezuela? I think the evidence suggests that they are about targeting Venezuela, and if we come to that conclusion, then it behoves us to act with alacrity, to do whatever we can to ensure that does not materialize. So for me, I think that is really the priority issue right now.
Okay, so Ambassador, let me say this. When this matter started out, Caribbean civil society was not entirely sure at the beginning, but it soon came to our attention that Venezuela is not one of the major producers of narcotics in the region, nor is it a major transshipment point in terms of illegal or illicit drugs. And we know that the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and the United States own intelligence services have recently stated that the Maduro government, is not the head or leading any drug cartel. We know of recent reports which indicate these things. So civil society is pretty clear that this is not about drugs. And so one of the questions we would have, and of course we're going to take action on Friday. Let me just inform the public that on Friday we are inviting Caribbean civil society in Trinidad and Tobago is inviting people to join us in the savannah opposite the church in Port of Spain to peacefully demonstrate, indicate our opinion on this question and to call for the region to remain a zone of peace. So the civil society is pretty clear, and we're inviting people, our listeners now on social media, who are still present with us and who will tune in tomorrow to join us on Friday. Dr. Fergus will confirm the time of that demonstration. But the question I have for you, Doctor, is Brother Comissiong, Ambassador Comissiong, is whether or not the clarity that exists in civil society based on our knowledge of the drug trade, our research into the drug trade, is there a similar clarity at the level of the heads of state, which is the level at which you function at in the diplomatic corps and so on? Do you get the impression that there's a similar clarity about the issue?
Well, you can only go on the basis of the statement that was issued. And the statement that was issued really straddled both interpretations. The statement that was issued basically spoke to both interpretations. It said that, yes, we are in favor of combating drug trafficking, narco trafficking. However, we insist that must be done within the existing cooperation frameworks and in keeping with international law. It also went on to speak about respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the countries of the region. So we can, as I said, we can only go on the basis of that. But as I indicated to you, we should not feel that it is only things that appear publicly that are happening. And you would well imagine that there are statesmen, stateswomen of the Caribbean community who would be engaging in quiet diplomacy on this matter with the U.S., counseling that whatever grievance, whatever contention that they may have with the government of Venezuela, that the way to deal with that is through peaceful means, through dialogue and through diplomacy. So I just want to say that to Caribbean people, that sometimes you may not see a government or government leaders doing something publicly, but that does not mean that quietly they're not engaging in quiet diplomacy. But I think that governments will do what governments will do, but the Caribbean people, the civil society, our Caribbean civil society has a very important role to play in this matter. And I think that if as we say, Shabaka, the analysis is that this is not so much about narco trafficking. This is really about targeting Venezuela for regime change. And that regime change can only come through a substantial military attack. And if that is the case, then civil society must do what it can to express solidarity and to surround Venezuela with that kind of concrete solidarity that will help to avert any decision to launch any destructive military attack on our sister country of Venezuela, because not only will that have devastating effects for Venezuela, but it will have devastating effects for the entire Caribbean community, for our tourism-based economies, for the transportation of goods into our region. It will spark a major migration crisis all across the region, and it will destroy our concept of and our insistence that our region in international law is a zone of peace. Because let's be very clear, we have constructed that concept of the Caribbean being a zone of peace in international law. It is to be found in that 1979 OAS resolution. It is to be found in the CELAC Declaration of 2014, and in several other subsidiary acts in international law. So this is not just sentiment. This is a construct that over decades Caribbean political leaders and governments have invested in constructing it and rooting it in international law.
Indeed.
Something to fight for and defend.
Yeah, I'm glad that you've helped us clarify that question of the zone of peace, because utterances from above were suggesting that it was some kind of anti-American slogan and not something rooted in a long-standing Caribbean tradition. So let me just clarify here. We have a flyer. It says, "Greetings, brothers and sisters. Join us as we stand together for peace and sovereignty. Hashtag Caribbean Zone of Peace. Let our voices be heard. We do not support the military action and occupation by the U.S. government in our region. We demand accountability for the extrajudicial killings carried out in international waters. As citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, we emphatically state that our sovereignty is not for sale. Join us in making our voices heard. Friday 25th, 10:30 a.m., Queen's Park, Savannah, opposite the Anglican Church." So civil society is on the move, Ambassador, and we will keep you posted as we continue to advance our solidarity with all decent and right-thinking people across the region.
Yes, it's very
Before you go, we are almost at the end of the program, and it just crossed my mind. Venezuela has had its revolution ongoing since Chavez took office. To what extent, in your opinion, can Venezuela withstand let's say the loss of Maduro and not see the revolution crumble?
Well, I wouldn't even want to go there. What I would say is that Venezuela is much more...
I know it's a difficult question for me to ask as well, but we are talking regime change. And the regime change may not be...
I want to make the point...
embedded in a single personality.
I want to make the point that Venezuela is much more prepared in 2025 than it was, let's say, in 2019, when the crisis emerged with Juan Guaido, to withstand this kind of threat. And not only is Venezuela, I was in Venezuela about maybe 2-3 weeks ago, and Venezuela has rebounded economically. You go through Caracas, the stores are filled with goods. There's no tension in the air. The Venezuelan people are going about their business as usual. The society is relatively united. And very importantly, Venezuela's major neighbors, Colombia and Brazil, whereas in 2019, those countries were ruled by right-wing regimes that were hostile to the Maduro administration. In 2025, it's the opposite. They're ruled by friendly governments. So Venezuela is in a much stronger position economically, diplomatically in 2025 than it was in 2019, and it was able to see off the threat in 2019. So I would be very, very optimistic that Venezuela in this condition will see off this threat, but it will need our solidarity and our support, and that is the message I would like to leave with listeners. Of course, it is my hope that the CARICOM governments, our nations, will rise up to the challenge and give our sister Caribbean nation of Venezuela the kind of support and solidarity that it deserves in this very difficult situation. But our people, our civil society, We look to our civil society to perhaps lead the way in a very principled defense of the notion of the Caribbean being a zone of peace, and a very principled defense of a country that has had, a very, very constructive and helpful relationship with the people of the Caribbean, a country that is our friend.
Yeah, indeed, that's a good.
Excellent answer, David. Because of course, I was in Venezuela too, and that's exactly the feeling that I got. There's this sense of optimism, and you feel it. You actually feel it.
They were celebrating
revolution
in October.
There's a sense of prosperity and well-being in Venezuela. And that's why I asked the question. It's a difficult question to ask, but I think it's important that people also understand that Venezuela is in a very positive place to confront U.S. aggression and to survive. I think that's important.
Dr. Fergus, you remember they were celebrating Christmas in October. They have actually started their Christmas celebration, and the people were in a very, very upbeat, very, very upbeat mood. And yes, anyhow, I mean, what we saw in Venezuela is a society that you would want to see continue and to thrive. A very positive society.
Indeed. So maybe we can close off that with those comments. And Shabaka, I don't know if you want to say something in addition to that, but we are at the top of the third half hour of the program, where we normally bring it to a close. And we want to thank, of course, all those who participated this evening, those who are online corrigers. We always welcome your comments, and Shabaka would have summarized your first post. So we thank you for participating, and of course we recognize Trinbagonians for Palestine 09, for Palestine. That also commented on that statement that you made, Shabaka, and of course our guests on the Cuban embargo situation. We thank you for coming, taking your time, and joining us to share your views on these issues this evening. We, of course, will continue to address these issues because it's doubtful that they would go away anytime soon. And as Shabaka indicated, the solidarity on Friday at 10:30 at the Oval. We look forward to having you there to demonstrate your solidarity with Venezuela and condemn the aggression of the United States to transform our peaceful Caribbean into a zone of war. Thank you very much.
My correction is not. You may be thinking about cricket. I know you are quite a cricketer yourself, but it's in Savannah opposite the Anglican Church. 10:30 a.m. on Friday morning. And of course, let me just say, it always warms our heart, Ambassador Comissiong, that someone of your ilk, someone of your intellectual capacity and your principled reasonings is operating at the level that you are, and that you will take the time to join us here on Indaba. Thank you very much, Ambassador Comissiong.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Barbados. See you on Friday.
See you next week.